go to the next room to make sure that's good also.
Okay, well, we're about ready to start anyway. We have a full house today. Thanks for coming to this session. I think you're going to find it very informative. We're going to talk about an identity and access management case study that I want to share with you. This is kind of the in the trenches experience. I'm still healing from the wounds. My name is Keith Fricke. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Mercy Health. We're the largest not-for-profit health system in the state of Ohio. We have some operations in Kentucky and also in Indiana. My agenda today consists of giving you some background on our journey. I also want to talk about some of the lessons learned and the gotchas along the way. Not sure how many people may be just starting down this road versus, having been through it or on your way. And talk about some of the things that we've been able to achieve. We frequently hear that identity and access management projects fail. And there's reasons for that. It's not an easy project to do. And I wanted to share with you the things that we learned along the way. And there are a couple people in the audience that have actually helped me out with this. One of the things that I wanted to do to level set this for you is our entry into this or down this road wasn't necessarily the traditional way. Most of people that are looking to get into an identity and access management project put a business case together and then they go sell it. Well, when I started in my role in November of 2009, there was already a line item in the budget for an identity and access management system, but it was only capital. So there was no operating there to cover licensing costs or, maintenance on the licensing or FTEs. So it's really important that when you're putting together your budget, you cover all of those things. I had also been informed that there was a previous attempt to put a product in for some sort of user provisioning system that had failed. No pressure there. And lastly, I think it's also very important in the context of this project for you to understand how our organization was changing at the time. We were structured pretty much as a federalist model, and we were moving to a model where we would provide enterprise service delivery across the different departments and business units that we had. So what that meant was, at the time, we had a lot of duplicity in services in the different markets because our home office sort of provided some governing direction, but our markets were largely self-driven. And so, what you can take away from that is there's an awful lot of legacy work that has to be caught up in terms of standards. Everybody does things differently in terms of process and technology. And depending upon where you are in your organization and its operational structure, how the timing on an identity and access management project works can either be very easy or very difficult, and for us it was the latter. A couple of things that I wanted to share with you about the vendor selection process as you're choosing a technology and implementing it is know who's doing the work. When we started evaluating some of the vendors, we found that some of them don't have the in-house expertise to do the implementation. They sell it to you, and then they outsource to a third party the implementation. And a couple of the third-party implementers that we talked to had no clue. So it was sort of easy to cross them off the list. Also, you want to confirm the use cases. I have a list in a slide coming up that I will share with you that for us was kind of eye-opening, especially because some of these use cases were things we hadn't anticipated ever happening. I also want to mention that some of the use cases I'll share with you may be specific to healthcare, but what I wanted to do is to prompt you to be thinking about how in your industry some of these types of peculiar situations may arise. But the point is, make sure that you have a well-documented list of the use cases for how you expect this system to function so that you can have the vendor show you that it works the way they tell you it will. And we found it valuable to do some field trips to look at customers who were already using the technology that we were considering purchasing And that helped us a lot in the selection process. But I'd also recommend that after you make a decision and choose a product, maybe 6 months afterwards, make another visit to some of those same vendors if your time and budget permits, because after you have a chance to really look under the covers of the technology and understand how it integrates into your business processes, you will gain some additional insights when you go back and look at the same technology that these other customers have already put in. If there's one thing that you take away from my presentation today, it's that your statement of work should be a fixed fee. If you do a time and materials, I guarantee you, you will run out of money. I talked to a number of customers that purchased the same product we did that went with time and materials, and that was their biggest regret. When we laid out our statement of work, we had about 27 deliverables. Each one had a price next to it for what it was going to cost us, and the vendor did not get paid until we signed off on each one of those. Now, interestingly enough, and there were some major scope changes along the way, but we started down this road about 4.5 years ago, and there are still 2 deliverables on that statement of work we have yet to achieve. So it's really important that you do that. I would also recommend that you walk through the statement of work line by line with the vendor and actually make the statement, this is what we take this to mean, is this what you intended it to mean? I could have done a better job of that, and I found out along the way that I didn't quite understand the terminology as they intended it to be, and it caused us a little bit of heartburn. So make sure you're on the same page before you even sign the statement of work. Account cleanup and maintenance is critical. It's sort of a tough thing to say if I could do it over again, whether we would have done it the same way or not that we had. Because we were coming together, moving from a federalist model into that enterprise services delivery, we had a lot of cleanup to do. We had somewhere between 7 and 9 Active Directory domains. We had a number of different HR systems. In some cases, a few of our markets used the same product, but they had their own instance. In other cases, they had a completely different product. Well, if you want your identity and access management and user provisioning system to work well, it should integrate with your LDAP/Active Directory infrastructure as well as your HR system. And so as we were trying to implement this, we were constrained schedule-wise by waiting for some of those other things to happen. If you can avoid that, that would be a recommendation. It worked out well for us, though, because when the major scope change came along that I'll talk about, having suffered through that experience that I just described, put us in a position to be agile enough to respond to the business's needs when we made those changes. You also need to know your applications. How clean is your data? Our naming format standards were all over the place, and that made it a challenge for us when we were trying to integrate the technology with business processes. And we found in some cases that we had a particular clinical application that was used in different markets, and they weren't all running the same level. And if you get down to the technical detail, there were some database schema differences, so they were using different fields for different things, and it ultimately drove us to create multiple connectors, which is the software that your provisioning system uses to connect to a target system and manage the life cycle of a computer account, either creating it, modifying its rights, or terminating it. So you want to do an inventory at that level of detail when you're looking at which target systems you'd like to integrate. The vendor recommended that we start with provisioning, and we made the decision to start with terminations. And that was a really good decision on our part, and I recommend it. The reason is, it's easier to build logic in a new system that you're trying to figure out that can go out and change the attributes of an existing account. So in this case, we were building logic to terminate accounts instead of trying to figure out how to build all the logic necessary to create new accounts. And if you think about it, for anybody that does provisioning manually, there's a lot of institutional knowledge about how those accounts get built, along with all of the technology, and there's a lot of decision-making that goes on in people's heads that's not always practical to duplicate in a computer system. And I would not expect that you could ever do full lights-out provisioning. There may always be the need, depending upon the nature of the application, for somebody to touch the process. We've done some really good work in automating a lot of things, but we still have people that need to touch accounts. Here are some of the use case questions that you should be thinking about when you're looking at a user provisioning system. In some cases, maybe these don't apply in your organization, but it's always good to ask the question because things change. Can your system handle an employee with more than one job? So in healthcare, we have people that may work in a radiology department during the week, and then they pick up extra hours on the weekend in the emergency department. Two totally different roles, two different access rights, so we have to build those accordingly. The reason that you want to ask this question is because if that person is in two roles, and then that weekend job goes away, when your system deprovisions or terminates their access, does it whack the access for the account that they use during the week? People aren't happy about that. How does it handle reusing account IDs? How does it handle former non-employees that are returning as employees and vice versa? In our system, our HR system only handles employees. So we have a completely different way to track the record of authority, if you will, or the authoritative source for non-employees. Well, when you change state from one way to the other, is the system able to understand that difference and handle it appropriately? Here's a funky one. How does it handle non-employed managers with employed direct reports? We outsourced part of our rev cycle department to a third party. So now there are non-employed managers that are still governing or leading people that are Mercy employees. The non-managers are not in our HR system, but our employees are. So you have to try to figure out, how is the system going to handle a situation like that? Because it's not really a perfect world at that point. How does it handle an employee that has more than one manager? We have that situation as well. If we get a feed from our HR system, it identifies a primary person that is the manager over that particular employee. But that person may have direct reporting relationships to other managers, and is the system able to handle that so that when those other managers that aren't listed as the primary want to grant access or request access, that the system even lets them do that? Because if the system is designed in a certain way, it may not even let that person request access rights for that direct report. How does it detect duplicate accounts so it doesn't reuse an account? And what sort of error handling does it have? Not sure if this is something that would be on your radar. It is in healthcare. The reason I want to share this with you is because this may be a feature you'd want to consider if your organization is acquiring another company and you have a large influx of new people that you have to add to a system. In our case, a couple of times a year, we have a large influx of students and residents, and we need to build lots of accounts at the same time. And also, as we were rolling our electronic medical record system out, we would move into a new market, and we would have thousands of people that we needed to build accounts for. So, does the system that you're evaluating have the ability to handle a bulk account creation? In our case, we're just using spreadsheets that are specially formatted and can be imported, but you want to know that. And you should expect these characteristics of IAM projects. They will always take longer than expected. If there are any IAM salespeople in here, I apologize, but if they give you a timeline, multiply it by 10. Because there's a lot of discovery that needs to happen, and the degree to which they dig into the complexities of your organization's business processes and technology is directly proportional to how long, or I should say indirectly proportional to how long it will take to get the job done. Long projects have scope changes. We had 2 big scope changes, one of which I'll talk about shortly. And you can expect that long projects will have project manager turnover. That happened on our side as well as on the vendor side. So you want to make sure that your project management methodology is solid so that as you're handing off this information about the history of the project to new project managers, the documentation is there. And there can be a lot of behind-the-scenes maintenance that takes place for some of these projects. As you're rolling them out and you start to operationalize it, there may be a lot of touching on a daily basis that's required to keep it running. As far as testing goes, the biggest recommendation I could make to you, especially if your statement of work is structured as a fixed fee, is the vendor is really anxious to get paid. So what they're going to do is test your environment under perfect world conditions by giving the input to their workflows and other automation exactly what they would expect in a perfect world. And then they're going to say, it works, and then they're going to want you to sign off on it. Well, what does the system do if it doesn't get the input it's expecting? If you sign off on that and then find that out afterwards, it's going to be harder for you to have the vendor on the hook for fixing that because they're going to say, well, you told us you accepted it. So my recommendation would be try to figure out ways to make the system do things based on conditions that you'd never expect to happen and see what the system does. You definitely don't want to find out that it has an adverse reaction to some sort of unexpected data format after you're in production. Something else that we talked about early on as more of a philosophical strategy is that when you're evaluating one of these systems, there's likely an end-user interface of some kind that you use in the request process. And when we took a look at the vendor solution that we ultimately chose, we assessed its ability to handle the use cases and some of the peculiar natures in healthcare and realized it wasn't going to be flexible for us enough that we would be comfortable with dealing with its limitations. So what we chose to do instead was build our own end-user interface. And there are some pros and cons to that. One of the philosophies that we had was, if you think about it, if you build all of your end-user interface logic into the request system, and then somewhere down the road you replace the request system, you're going to have to rebuild all of what that looks like, and that's going to change your user experience. Our philosophy was, well, if we built an end-user interface that was separate as a front end from the back-end engine that did all of the provisioning work, and we made it web-based, we could just link it into whatever request system we had and skin it with whatever HTML we needed to have in order to make it look like a seamless user experience. And that actually worked out well for us because we did move to a different request system, and that's exactly what we were able to do. So building your own end-user interface may give you more control and flexibility, and it may be able to better integrate with a request system. But it could cost you more in development time and support. And maintaining can be labor intensive. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're looking at those use cases and how this system will work with your users and the people that are requesting. What sort of flexibility do you need versus what the end user interface of the product can provide you? As far as our implementation goes, I mentioned we started with terminations. It took us 12 months to implement that across the enterprise. We started in August of 2012 and moved through that by August of 2013. I think for the 7 or so markets that we had, we were on about a 2-month implementation window. So we did it in a phased approach, and here are some metrics. Between January 1st and August 1st of 2014, we had a little over 5,800 lights out terminations. So that meant that when HR put a termination in our HR system, it sent information to our system to trigger disabling the user accounts for the number of systems that we had integrated. At the time we started this project, my organization had about 1,200 applications in its portfolio, and we've rationalized that down to about 750. So for any systems that aren't plugged in an automated fashion, we've built workflows that send emails out to system administrators, letting them know the information they need to either provision the account or to terminate it. And then we had 8,500 manual trigger terminations. So any of you that have been involved in any internal, external audits where they come in and do a random sample of accounts that are still active for people that are no longer there, it's a lot to do with the people that need to put the request in the system to make that happen in the first place. So this is another metric that we were tracking based on getting information that somebody was leaving the organization, but it had not been officially put through the system yet. So instead of waiting for that to trigger, we wanted to stay ahead of that. So you may be asking yourself, why do we have so many terminations? Is that a lot of turnover? Well, in this case, it's a combination of things. There are people that move between jobs, and in some cases, their access gets terminated. And in the other case, we had a large amount of outsourcing that we did. So these were employees that were part of RevCycle that got outsourced, but they still did work on our account. So their status as an employee triggered the termination of the account, and then we had to reactivate them as a non-employee. In May of 2014, we implemented our ServiceNow request module. If you go back a year prior to that, in May of 2013, we put in ServiceNow to handle our incidents. And a year later, we went live with the request module. So during that time, we had been doing our terminations. We finished up in August of 2013. We started talking to the ServiceNow implementation team around October of 2013, and it took us between then and May to get what we needed in place to integrate our system with our ServiceNow request system. And I have some screenshots that'll show you kind of what the user experience looks like so you get a feel of what we were able to achieve. The biggest thing that we found when we went live was that the workforce training and culture shift was the biggest impact. And this is another takeaway for you. As an example, in our specific case, our previous request process was sorely lacking. It was a homegrown system that had some required fields, but then the person submitting the request was free texting what they wanted in a text box, which made it really difficult. It usually went into a black hole. Well, we told people that with the new system, here's the way it's going to work. When you hire an employee, they're going to get put in the HR system. The HR system is going to send that information on a daily basis to our back end, and that back end is going to send an email out to you as the manager. And you're going to have to click a link that it instructs you in that email, and it's going to take you into the system and prompt you through a series of screens to request their access. We need to do that for audit purposes because that's the other thing all the auditors ask for, is show us the audit trail of who authorized this and when. Well, I think people heard us tell them that, but I don't think that they really believed that we meant it. Because we got a lot of phone calls from people saying, this system isn't working because I hired a new person 2 weeks ago, they started today and they didn't have their access. And we come to find out the email was still sitting in their inbox, they never bothered to respond to it. So it's really important to make sure that people understand that if you're setting new expectations because your system is changing the way that they were used to doing their work, that they may not believe you at first until it really happens. We built 3,200 roles and 700 entitlements. One of the things that we did is we took time to learn in each of the facilities what the different departments' needs were in terms of like the 80-20 rule. So for a person in a given department, what's generally the access that they need in terms of applications? And as you'll see in some of the screen prints I'll show you, that helps guide the manager that's requesting access through that process without necessarily putting the burden on them to know what access all of their people need. We've set this up so that only managers can submit access requests, and that's by design because we want the managers to be the authority of record for approving that access. If you're not a manager, the access selections are grayed out in the system so that you don't have the ability to submit a request if you're not authorized. Managers can designate delegates they go on vacation, somebody else can submit requests on their behalf. Or in some cases, as you get higher up in the organization, those folks would rather have the administrative assistant do that kind of access submission. We build non-employee accounts with an expiration date, and we do user access reviews every 180 days. That puts some responsibility on the business units to let us know that the people that have access, if they're non-employees, still need to have that access. This is a bit of an eye chart. What I want you to learn from this is you really need to understand your business processes. We had a pretty good idea of what we wanted to do. And after we went live, the business came back to us and said, well, is there a way that we could improve how long it takes for an Active Directory account to get created? So we pulled a team of people together that included IT, information security, human resources, marketing, and HR information systems. And we spent a day doing a flow diagram of what the current process looked like. And we had some help from some Six Sigma black belts. And then we went through the same exercise to figure out how we could streamline it. Because the goal of the organization was to have, from the time that somebody accepted a job offer to 14 days later, that they were onboarded with everything that they needed. And so we had to go back to the drawing board and re-engineer some of the workflow in order to accommodate that request. Now, something else that worked to our benefit was at that time, the organization was establishing a monthly operational report that senior executives were looking at. And one of the key performance indicators was that IT and HR were jointly working together to ensure that we were meeting that 14-day goal. So we got the resources that we needed to re-engineer the system in a way to help make that more efficient. And what you'll find as well is there were things that HR learned about IT and vice versa that we never really understood before until we got everybody in a room and started talking. Like, for example, I didn't know that HR had their own help desk software and that they were taking requests to get the initial setup in our HR system before IT was even notified about it. So it's a really good exercise to make sure that you nail down what the business process needs to look like. This is the main screen of our ServiceNow system, and it provides people with a list of icons. There's a couple of different views. This is just one I wanted to show you. So if somebody that's a manager level clicks the accounts and access, what happens is it takes them to our end user interface, and what this does is it populates that manager's list of all their direct reports. If the direct report doesn't show up in there, they can search for that person. This gets populated from our HR system so that when a new hire starts, that person shows up in this list. So if I'm a manager and I'm hiring somebody, I get an email notification from our system saying that you have a new person starting and you need to click on this link to go into the system in order to select the access rights that they need. And when they go into the system, it brings up the list of users. They can click that user and go in and submit that access. Based on the person's job role, their job location, and their department, it pre-populates a list of access rights based on those discussions that we had with those departments about which applications are commonly used by that role. It's never going to be 100% perfect, and you shouldn't strive for that, but it goes a long way towards helping people select access more efficiently, because my experience in the past has been if a manager isn't sure what they should check, what do? They click everything. And then there may be some additional entitlements that they want to choose. It could be a file share or some other access, so they can go through that list as well and pick what they need. That's a work in progress. There are a lot of entitlements, and that's an ever-evolving thing. As new needs come up and new file shares get created or other types of access rights, there's a team that we have that continues to build these entitlements. I've mentioned in that workflow that if somebody is an employee, they come in through our HR system. For people that are non-employees, the manager still goes into the same system, and they go through this list, and they're basically populating these fields with all the same information that would come over from the HR system had they been an employee. And then at this point, when they submit it, it puts it into the work stream the same way that it would if it came from the HR system. Any questions so far? How am I doing on time? Yeah. Okay. Yes? How did you handle shared accounts and functional accounts? Question is, how did we handle shared accounts and functional accounts? One day at a time. We spent a lot of time when we were cleaning up Active Directory and doing those consolidations, even just going through the exercise of identifying, there's something called an orphaned account. It's an account that exists that you don't know who it belongs to. And then as we were consolidating HR systems, we found cases where you had one employee that had more than one account, and in other cases you had two employees that were apparently for some reason tied to the same account. And then you have all the service accounts that we build on a lot of our servers to do things in the background. So there was a lot of work that we had to do to figure out, which of those were which, because you don't necessarily want to decommission service accounts because that will break things. So it's all part of the roadmap that you need to figure out as you're laying this out. Was there any other part of that I needed to touch on?
No, I was just curious if you included those in, particularly the functional accounts, because you mostly talked about people.
Yeah. So like in our organization, we have clinical workstations, and to make it easy to use, we want clinical people to walk up to a workstation that's already logged in but locked down. And in order to comply with HIPAA, you need accounts that are unique. So we've built a unique account for each workstation, so even though it's already logged in, that account is only works on that one workstation. But we consider that a service account. So those are things that you want to take into consideration. And as we went through some enhancements, we were being asked to create some tools that would help provision service accounts, so that people could request those much in the same way that they would as part of an employee account being created. Because what you'll find is that the IT people, if they have the rights to do so, will just go off and build those accounts. And it's helpful to be able to track all of that stuff so that you're keeping all of your accounts in the central database that's managing those access.
Do you have a central
Yeah, the question is, did we have a centralized HR? The answer is yes and no. And the reason is because they were figuring out what they wanted to look like when they grew up, just like we were, moving from the federalist model to the enterprise model. But eventually, yeah, they had one team that worked across the enterprise. But when we first started down this road, we even were finding when we went from market to market, each HR department did handle terminations differently. So we had to map all of that first and figured out what it looked like in its current state, and then try to figure out how to standardize that.
So does that system, do those administrators work under IT or
they work under IT, the HRIS people. Yeah. Yes.
Maybe deal with that. Are you covering how you deal with third-party payer vendors or service providers like release of information and in-network physician access?
Well, the release of information generally goes through the medical records department, and they work closely with the privacy officers to make all of that happen. As far as provisioning accounts for third-party vendors, we have a whole vendor management group in IT that front doors that whole process, so that we do evaluations on the technology, and then at the point we make an evaluation and a decision to do service or take service from that vendor, we have a formal request process and a change management process, and we have some architecture review committees that look at the requirements, and the account provisioning is a piece of that.
So gating goes into that so that you have periodic checks to see if the accounts are still live rather than used.
That gets back to the user access review. We primarily focus on the physician office piece of that, but because we set up non-employee accounts with that end of life date, if somebody doesn't get back to us and let us know that that account still needs to be enabled, it winds up getting shut off. So we try to proactively send emails out, and that's one of the things our system does, is it looks at the database tables for the expiration date on that account and sends an email out to that person and says, you need to go into the system and validate that you still need that access. If not, if they choose not to or miss it or ignore it, they'll call us if they need it because the system shuts it off. Yes?
In this process, have you contemplated the difference between deprovisioning, expiring, and removing accounts?
Yeah, I think we have. Especially when medical records and the people in our EMR security team told us that they wanted us to reuse user accounts. We couldn't delete an account after the account or after the person left. And as an aside, thanks for asking the question, one thing I forgot to mention is that when you build these processes, you need to make sure that you're thinking about if this person is leaving the organization and there's a litigation hold, how do you make sure that you're handling that in the right way? So we typically deprovision the accounts and we have to leave them disabled because the request was if those people ever come back, they would want to use the same account again. So I think that kind of answered the question for us because of what the business requirements were. Yes? So the question is for non-employees, what is the process for populating the screens to show them what access rights they can choose? Typically, most of the non-employee accounts that we create require a Mercy Health employee as a sponsor. And as part of that request submission, they know what type of access that person needs to fulfill the job that they're being hired to do. And they will include that in that request. So it may bring that list up, and if it's not in the list, then they can do a search and look through the entire list of applications in order to pick what they need. So, yeah.
Early on in your presentation, you also mentioned the difference between the capital expenditure up front and the support you needed to go on to make the solution work ongoing. You talk a little bit about how much you end up hiring on or adding to FTE headcount, or how you might be able to calculate the numbers we might need.
Yeah, that's a good question, and then I want to make sure I get through a couple more slides. We've had a number of contractors helping us with this. I think initially we had 2 help my internal team with the end user interface, and then with some of the changes, we wound up with 3 people. I've got a team of about 5 people that are on the IAM analyst side, and what they do every day is look at the data integrity. They make sure that the information that's coming across from the HR system is as expected. They run some reports, do some of the metrics. They're also involved in working with some of the application owners when we want to integrate a new system as a target. On the actual engineering and support side, I've got about 5 people or so. So it's based on the complexity of your organization and the scale. We have 35,000 employees in our organization. That doesn't include all of the non-employees. So, an operation that big will take a staff that's pretty decent size. Let me talk about this real quick. This is a very specific use case because it's in healthcare, but I think you may pull some value out of it just based on the nature of some things. We use Epic as our EMR. When you build an account in Epic, there's actually 2 parts to it. An EMP record is for everybody, And an SCR record is only for people that have the ability to prescribe medicine. When you're building those two accounts, what we found was there were two different methods by which the technology had to connect in order to provision an account. One used web services, the other used HL7. And I've already mentioned that there were a couple of groups that required reusing accounts. And then we worked through with the Epic security team to define some of their requirements. So, for example, they wanted the EMP record disabled for termination, but they wanted the SCR record left active. You have to build logic to make that happen. So all I'm saying is that as you're looking on a case-by-case basis for your target systems, make sure you understand not only those use cases that we went over, but the ways in which the technology need to interface with the target system in order to make the provisioning happen. And we still have the security team handling part of the provision manually. They have huge matrices of job role and all of the functional attributes for the security. You can't really ever expect in any practical way to take that and put it in a system that does it all for you.
Your positions as far as credentialing, does credentialing feed your IAM?
That's a great question. So credentialing is, we have medical staff offices at all of our hospitals that ensure that physicians that are not employees but are granted able to practice medicine in our hospitals, they have to go through a process to make sure that they're vetted. And we found that the systems that each medical staff office used was by the same company, but they were all across the board in the way in which they were implemented, even down to the point where they were using different data fields for different things, and we could not even use it as an authoritative source. So yeah, that was bad. So just a couple of thoughts, and what's happening next as I have to wrap up here. We have a lot of logic built into our end-user interface. What we want to do is move to a model where we have a web services layer, and we have a gentleman in the audience here who came up with that suggestion for us, so thank you, Mr. Senf. The idea is you take the logic out of the end-user interface, put it in a web services layer, and at that point, the end-user interface becomes a data collection input, and then we'll get rid of it and move it into ServiceNow. So everything will be in one place. The other thing is we'll always be building roles and entitlements. And as people started wrapping their arms around it, they said, hey, can you make it do this? So we have a list of enhancements that we're working through. And it's important that we stay in the loop on HR system upgrades, as well as the upgrades for any other systems that we've integrated, because if they make changes to their system and they don't tell us about it, things may not work, as we had originally intended for it. So I have a few minutes left. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Don't be a...
In regards to your testing environment, did you have to build out a whole separate AD and test systems to run testing?
So the question is about the testing environment. Our provisioning system and the end-user interface have dev, test, and production environments. Active Directory was a little bit of an oddball there because we wanted to wait until we had consolidated all the Active Directory domains first. We're in the process of building an Active Directory test environment, but right now there are parts of our testing that require using test accounts in production. So I think I can take one more question, if anyone has one. Okay, well, I appreciate your time and attention today. I hope you found this informative. Thank you.